Testing. 1, 2, 3.
So the beautiful thing about this is a great spot. You know, People's Forum. The setup, the way they have the camera organized, the live streams amazing. So it creates an amazing video that we embed in this thing called Revolution 1313, which yeah. And I'll talk a little bit about it so that you see where we're headed or something like that. Is that good? Yeah, sounds good. All right, so let's see. I can't see. Are we good? Are we ready to roll? Yeah, we're going? Okay. All right, well. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Welcome to Revolution 1013. It's a great pleasure and an honor to welcome two of my favorite contemporary thinkers, Brandon Terry and Cornel West, to think about one of my favorite 20th century thinkers and revolutionaries, Malcolm X. Why return to Malcolm X today in April 2022? Well, one reason, of course, is that Brandon, you've just written two brilliant essays published in the New York Review of Books, and they alone would warrant us coming back and talking about it. The other reason is that Malcolm X really personifies the worldly revolutionary philosopher whose figure we've been exploring this year in Revolution 1313. And to set the stage then very quickly, just to motivate the discussion, let's just recall why we're here at Revolution 1313. We started from the question of what it is that we can find in the work of worldly revolutionary philosophers that we can't find in the work of academic critical theorists. Particularly as it relates to the question of praxis, right? And the reason we started this whole inquiry was that if indeed we're going to push critical theory towards praxis, then who in fact should we be in conversation with, right? And how does that change the conversation? Now, the problematic kind of has shifted a little bit over the course of the year, with our different interlocutors and with our different thinkers that we've been thinking with, from the Combahee River Collective to Rosa Luxemburg to Albert Woodfox and George Jackson. We've been exploring things like the material conditions for the production of work and how that affects the work that's produced. We've been also thinking about the different temporalities of critique of critical theory on the one hand and of praxis on the other, right? The time frames, the different ways in which kind of critique extends in a way over centuries, right? We converse with Marx, we go back to the ancients, but the time frame of praxis is far less extended in a way. Now, with Malcolm X, though, the question becomes, what can he tell us about our struggles for racial justice today? What can you tell us about abolition, for instance? And there's some really interesting intersections in your pieces on the question of abolition. In the introductory post that's online, we tried to highlight one of the major differences, I think, with Malcolm X versus other, more uh, armchair critical theorists. And that had to do with the positions that he was taking at the time. And we're going to talk about this in terms of the internationalism, in terms of the movement to human rights, was a very strategic move at the time, right? And the role of strategy was very important there in a way that is different than the kind of theoretical work we do on rights today at a law school, at critiques of rights, et cetera. When we think about, even when we do critiques of human rights today, it's a very different thing that we do than what Malcolm X was doing, which was turning back then to the international context, to international human rights during a period of anti-colonial nationalist movements in Africa and Asia, where there was a particular opening that he was trying to kind of push the struggle into. And that's one way in which his work was very different than the other kind of work that was being done in critical theory at the time. But that's just an example. In any event, that is one way to think of what motivates the conversation today. And there's really no one better to do that with us than Brandon Terry and Cornel West. Brandon has accompanied us for many years in these 1313s. We had one conversation on Fanon, actually. Remember, that was the earliest one with Homi Bhabha and Emily Apter. We did another year, we did Malcolm X and the Vietnam speech at Riverside Church. Martin Luther King. Right. That's going to be a constant. That's going to be a constant Freudian slip, right? Or I mean, right? It is right. Martin Luther King and his Vietnam speech at Riverside. We also did one on Bernie Sanders and political revolution for Praxis 1313. And then before COVID, actually, right before COVID, we were going to get together to do W.E.B. Du Bois's Dark Water, right? And then we got hit with the pandemic. So this is our first time back in person, and it's really exciting. It's really thrilling to be reading Malcolm X together. Of course, Brandon joins us from Harvard, where he's a professor of political philosophy, of African American studies and social theory, one of our nation's leading thinkers on the political philosophy of Martin Luther King, co-editor with Tommy Selby of the brilliant collection To Shape a New World, also the editor of the Boston Review collection, 50 Years Since Malcolm X, and the author of a forthcoming book called The Tragic Vision of the Civil Rights Movement. That's a reconstruction of the philosophical foundations, really, of the historiographical debates concerning the African-American civil rights movement, and working kind of a synthesis of methods from political theory, philosophy, history, literary theory, African-American studies, to present a normative, to articulate the normative significance of those historical narratives. So it's really great to have you back, Brandon. And it is a delight and an honor to also welcome Dr. Cornel West, who, like Brandon, needs no introduction, one of our leading thinkers in this country today. Professor West is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice at Union Theological Seminary. He's been a professor and has taught over the years at Union Theological, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, University of Paris. He's written, of course, over 20 books, has edited 13, best known maybe for these classics like Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. He's also produced 3 spoken word albums, including Never Forget. So it's wonderful to have you with us this evening. So let me do this. What we're going to do is we're going to first ask Brandon to intervene on Malcolm X, and then I'll give the floor to Dr. West, and then I'll jump in and we'll get the conversation going. Brandon, welcome and thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Bernard. It's an honor to be back. It's an honor to be down here at the People's Forum. I want to thank Columbia Law School and the Committee on Intellectual Life for bringing me down. I'll be here for a couple of days doing a bunch of talks in and around Columbia. So I'm excited to visit and share in the great intellectual community. But of course, I'm always the most excited to be here with Bernard, with Brother West. I don't exaggerate even a bit when I say that these are two of the people I look up to most in all of academia. They're people who, a lot of, it's funny that you're talking about, praxis and academic philosophers. There's a way in which the study of philosophy and critical theory can become scholastic, and people forget that philosophy is really about how to live, and that critical theory is about how to change the world. And these are two people who've never forgotten that. They try to do it with all their breath, all their work, and it's an honor to sit up here with you all and absorb your wisdom as always. And it's a real honor to be here to talk about Malcolm X. I'm coming to terms with the fact that I'm not quite as young as I used to be, but I still imagine myself where I was back in the 1990s, sometimes when Malcolm Mania was at its height. And I came of political maturity in that era, where Malcolm was a really difficult figure to avoid. His image was buoyed by a Black nationalist revival. It's the era of the Million Man March. It's the era of the Black nationalist turn in hip hop with folks like Public Enemy, X Clan, KRS-One, Tribe Called Quest, Tupac Shakur. You're seeing his image in rhetoric and films, right? Spike Lee's incredible biopic starring Denzel Washington. The late John Singleton's Higher Learning and Boys in the Hood. And for many of us, and I really count myself among this group, Malcolm was a kind of brook of fire that we passed through on the way to political maturity. I don't even remember exactly how I came into possession of the autobiography. It seemed like it was everywhere. Maybe my Black nationalist uncle gave it to me. Maybe I found it on my mother's eclectic bookshelf. But I first read it around age 12 and was immediately transformed. You see, I grew up in Baltimore, in and around Baltimore during the previous high tide of the area's problems with community violence, heroin and cocaine addiction, and white flight. My family knew these forces intimately. Both of my brothers were incarcerated for most of my childhood, my oldest brother being arrested for heroin distribution when I was 5 years old, and only returning home from federal prison right before my 21st birthday. Baltimore then, even more than now, wore its race and class segregation garishly, evoking nothing so much as Frantz Fanon's description of the colonial city, a compartmentalized world, a world divided in two, where it is clear that what divides this world is first and foremost what species, what race one belongs to. For me then, Malcolm seemed to offer a kind of unifying explanation of the blatant injustice and intractable suffering in our corner of the world. In a 1963 speech at UC Berkeley, Malcolm proclaimed that our people in the Negro community are trapped in a vicious cycle of ignorance, poverty, disease, sickness, and death. There seems to be no way out, no way of escape. The Black masses, he went on, remain trapped in the slums. And because there seems to be no hope or no other escape, we turn to wine, we turn to whiskey, we turn to reefers, marijuana, and even to the dreadful needle, seeking an escape. That feeling of no escape and self-destruction felt especially suffocating in the 1990s, when the prospects for remaking American society on radical terms all seemed exhausted. In the midst of overlapping crack cocaine, street violence, and zero tolerance policing epidemics, it's not surprising, therefore, that Malcolm became, again, an intoxicating figure, maybe even more so in death than in life. His life seemed to offer a compelling model for overcoming drug addiction and nihilism through spiritual revelation, self-exertion, and discipline. His life seemed so compelling, in fact, that on occasion, his biography could spill over into conservative rhetoric about Black self-help that suggested that the race could achieve a transcendent transformation in mass through soulcraft and self-organization alone. These readings of Malcolm's conservative appropriations overlooked the revolutionary currents and horizons that animate so much of his thought and which make him such an important interlocutor for a series like this one. This does not mean, however, that it's easy to navigate the remaining difficulties that we confront when talking about Malcolm as a revolutionary and as a worldly philosopher. Now, Malcolm at times seemed to make his revolutionary aims plain. In 1963's Message to the Grassroots, he tried to draw a distinction between what was then popularly called the Negro Revolution, encapsulating the Southern theater of the nonviolent civil rights movement, and his own ideal of a Black revolution. Granting that the word revolution is thrown about too loosely and without historical analysis by people who don't come to this, Malcolm argues that authentic revolution is distinguished by both its goals and its methods. Genuine revolution, Malcolm argued, aims at independence with land as its prerequisite and promises a complete overturn, a complete change, as he wrote in his autobiography. Revolution, Malcolm contends, must reconcile itself to inevitable violence on the grounds that revolution does not compromise or negotiate in pursuit of its legitimate aims. Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, Malcolm argued, especially not out of any misguided sense of moral obligation to the enemies of the people, internal or otherwise. There's no such thing as a nonviolent revolution, Malcolm proclaimed. The only kind of revolution that's nonviolent is the Negro Revolution. The only revolution based on loving your enemy is the Negro Revolution. The only revolution in which the goal is a desegregated lunch counter and a desegregated public toilet. You can sit down next to white folk on the toilet. That's no revolution. Revolution is based on land. Land is the basis of all independence. It's the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. These arguments, as Malcolm goes on to pursue in the speech, are familiar ones in the history of Black nationalist thought. It's a tradition which has long been skeptical about the power of moral suasion and the sharing of civic and intimate life with whites. Black nationalism's classical proponents, including Martin Delany, Marcus Garvey, Harry Haywood, and Malcolm's own parents, imagined political sovereignty over land as a necessary condition of Black liberation. But the cultural critic Harold Cruz, surveying the Malcolm-inspired currents of the new Negro nationalism and the Black Power revolt, could not bring himself to understand why exactly Malcolm and his self-professed inheritors were so enamored with this language of revolution. Their chief practical ends, Cruz coolly suggested, involved political reformism and cultural pluralism more than revolution. Malcolm, after all, famously discussed not just bullets, but ballots, arguing for African Americans to sway elections with racial bloc voting and to use ethnic machine politics to seize control of local government, policing, and business in their communities. And when Malcolm founded his short-lived Organization for Afro-American Unity, following his violent split with Elijah Muhammad, their program spoke most prominently of cultural revolution. Repeating E. Franklin Frazier's thesis that African cultural identities were obliterated by the slave trade, Malcolm called for an extensive program of cultural revolution to, quote, unbrainwash an entire people. Culture, he argued, is an indispensable weapon in the freedom struggle, and he saw education in Black history, African and African American, independent support for Black artists and arts education, and the adoption of distinctively African names, clothing, and hairstyles is all part of cultivating the powers of self-regard he thought necessary to sustain political struggle. It was how he thought we could live with dignity in the face of white supremacist propaganda. But while these projects could be pursued without land, Malcolm's reticence to fully disavow the nationalist ideal of territorial control reflects an enduring interest in the alternative and experimental projection of sovereignty that Eldridge Cleaver rightly identified as the key feature of Black nationalism. Not only was Malcolm among the earliest to call for African Americans to refuse service in Vietnam, but he also famously argued that Black people should eschew civil rights agitation in favor of a campaign seeking the prosecution of the United States at the United Nations for the systematic violation of Black folks' human rights. Such a project reflects nothing so much as the view, enacted in Malcolm's own ad hoc diplomacy, that Black political peoplehood and political aspiration are not subordinate to the horizons of American civic nationalism. That's the model of race relations and minority politics. Malcolm was after something else. Indeed, Malcolm's arguments in this period reflect a sense that any politics which aspires to Black self-determination, any experiment in Black sovereignty, and even the reliable recognition of Black people's basic civil and political rights will need to be nested within a global balance of forces and solidarities that could compel respect for these claims. This is resonant with Marcus Garvey's political and social theory, but it replaces the dream of Black empire with a surprising faith in global governance and independent Black diplomacy. In 1964's The Ballot or the Bullet, Malcolm argued that civil rights means you're asking Uncle Sam to treat you right. Human rights are something you're born with. Human rights are your God-given rights. Human rights are the rights that are recognized by all nations of this earth. And anytime anyone violates your human rights, you can take them to the World Court. Expand the civil rights struggle to the level of human rights. Take it into the United Nations, where our African brothers can throw their weight on our side, where our Asian brothers can throw their weight on our side, where our Latin American brothers can throw their weight on our side, and where 800 million Chinese are sitting there waiting to throw their weight on our side. This world-making project, to use Adam Getachew felicitous term, is so central to Malcolm's thought that he at times even elides common racial distinctions to posit a global movement of Black revolution, which he defined in December 1963 as the struggle of the non-whites of this earth against their white oppressors, crediting Black revolution with sweeping white supremacy out of Asia as well as Africa. But it's jarring, I think, to read such optimism about the United Nations, international human rights law, and the possibility of third world solidarity over 5 decades later. Surprisingly, the kind of careful institutional analysis that Malcolm offers in the very same speech about the seniority system of the US Senate and its control of legislative committee chairmanship is all utterly lacking in his account of the United Nations. He glaringly fails to mention the disproportionate power of the Security Council or assess the weakness of UN enforcement mechanisms in the face of American economic and military might. Nor does Malcolm have anything to say about how a plan to shame the United States on the world stage of the UN, which would require Chinese and possibly Soviet support, would manage to elude the anti-communist repression that derailed earlier efforts to do the same thing from the NAACP and the National Negro Congress. It's fashionable now to celebrate Malcolm's turn to human rights as a compelling act of political judgment. But these omissions, along with Malcolm's underdeveloped analysis of anti-Black racism and human rights violations within the Third World, seem fatal. Some commentators, like the late Manning Marable and Michael Kazin, connect Malcolm's human rights discourse to a global socialist imaginary. But it pales on this front in comparison to W.E.B. Du Bois's 1947 petition, which explicitly argues that the United Nations should attack US racism because that is the key tool of monopolistic capital to destroy democracy and in doing so, enable the spread of imperialism, poverty, and domination. Malcolm's arguments, despite their moral valence in the liberal discourse of human rights, seem to utterly lack the realist dimension of either the NAACP's Cold War civil rights liberalism or Martin Luther King's eminent critique of US militarism. Those traditions, those arguments, in contrast to Malcolm's human rights talk, effectively exploited the fleeting leverage offered by the contest of Cold War powers and their competing egalitarian vocabularies. For all the enthusiasm now for so-called Black internationalism, this balance of forces in space of argument has utterly collapsed, with no leading nation's authority indexed in any meaningful way to the question of Black liberation or racial equity. And while African migration has more tightly entangled the African diaspora in thick interpersonal ties than ever before, the cultural discourse of Pan-Africanism may actually be more powerfully in service now of the managerial power of elite African migrants to the West in finance and industry than any viable left internationalism. A question then for us as inheritors of Malcolm is what remains of his political philosophy and praxis if the particular revolutionary vision he advocated seems fundamentally eclipsed. And the question of remains is not just a question about what is most defensible and inspiring, but what is also most powerful and continues to circulate with real effects in our political life. I want to end my opening remarks then by venturing one piece of Malcolm's thought that I think accounts somewhat for his enduring influence and popularity within Black political life. This is what I call Malcolm's Black populism. I'm also interested in other things about Malcolm's universal reflections on crime and moral agency, but we can talk about that in our discussion afterwards. So what do I mean by Black populism? On the view defended by scholars like Bart Bonikowski and Noam Gidron, populism is a form of politics predicated on a moral distinction, a moralized distinction between corrupt elites and the virtuous people, with the latter viewed as the sole legitimate source of political power and authority. My contention is that Malcolm pioneered a form of Black populism in his rhetoric, predicated on a highly moralized distinction between the virtuous Black working class and poor masses who are authentically Black and a corrupt Black elite whom he defines as inauthentic and treacherous. Now, this division is not totally unprecedented in Black political thought. Marcus Garvey, Zora Neale Hurston, E. Franklin Frazier all railed against the small Black elite of their eras. But Malcolm developed his critique in direct response to the classical phase of the civil rights movement and the class fragmentation and expansive Black elite that movement helped create. Indeed, Malcolm's greatest rhetorical construction ever may have been essentially populist rather than nationalist, and that's his famous distinction between the house Negro and the field Negro. Drawing on the folk history of slavery, Malcolm used the image of the house Negro and the field Negro to draw critical attention to two features of Black political life. The first and most important was the fact that in the absence of widespread political participation and free debate, Black spokespersons were the ones who would articulate the ostensible demands of Black people through constructions of the group that were severely class-inflected but presented as the universal commitments of the race. So while civil rights liberals treated the matriculation of a small handful of Blacks to formally segregated universities or the desegregation of white-owned spaces of public accommodations as victories for the race, Malcolm insisted constantly on the fact that such victories would hardly improve the lot of the truly disadvantaged, those who were languishing in America's ghettos and couldn't afford to stay at the newly integrated hotels or attend the newly integrated colleges. The second feature of Malcolm's House Negro, Field Negro distinction is that, as E. Franklin Frazier detailed in Black Bourgeoisie, Black social life is rife with struggles for class distinction and respectability, which often further humiliate and violate the poor while threatening the self-respect and dignity of the well-to-do. The polemical force with which Malcolm presented these arguments made them difficult to evade, and much of what constituted the left wing of the civil rights movement, including Martin Luther King, felt implicated and compelled to develop a politics that would be better capable of meeting Malcolm's objections. The danger, however, of Malcolm's populism and the significance of that concept as a way of thinking about his class politics is that he shifts very quickly from an account of divergent material interest between Black elites and the Black working class to charges of corruption, betrayal, and psychopathology. The house Negro, in other words, isn't just materially invested in the proximity to white elites. He pathologically loves his master on Malcolm's account and is willing to sacrifice self-respect and solidarity to fulfill this devotion, this unrequited love. The charge of irrationality and pathology is important because it then sets the stage for Malcolm's charge that his debates with Black political leadership in the liberal wing of the civil rights movement do not actually reflect reasonable disagreement or the legitimate pursuit of divergent interests. He makes them appear as though they reflect the corruption of this elite class and the corruption of the white elite they ultimately serve. The job of Black elites, even when they engage in protest politics, Malcolm argues, is to stifle genuine revolutionary dissent and the voice of the masses. The irony, however, is that this construction uses the fact of class divergence to then reassert and refound the possibility of a Black collective voice, but instead places that in the figure of the authentic masses and their acclaimed representatives like Elijah Muhammad or Malcolm himself. So here's a quote from one of Malcolm's speeches where he says, "The 8 million non-voting Negroes," so the politically inarticulate, the 8 million non-voting Negroes are the majority, the downtrodden Black masses. They have refused to vote or to take part in politics because they reject the Uncle Tom approach of the clergy politician leadership that has been handpicked for the American Negroes by the white man himself. The clergy politician leadership does not speak for the Negro majority. They don't speak for the Black masses. They speak for the Black bourgeoisie, the brainwashed, white-minded, middle-class minority who, because they are ashamed of being Black and don't want to be identified with Black or as being Black, are seeking to lose this identity by mingling, mixing, intermarrying, and integrating with the white man. The next president would be wise to try and learn what the Black masses want. And the only way to do this, the only way to find this out is by listening to the man who speaks for the Black masses of America, the same Mr. Muhammad who is labeled by you as a Black supremacist and a racist. Now, why does this matter? Well, first, I think theoretically, an investigation of Malcolm's populism complicates a story that critics of populism tend to tell because it involves the peculiar populism of in-group minority politics. So an intervention like Malcolm's, which might be anti-pluralist and repressive if it were to gain political power in a state or was formulated as the representative subject of the polity as a whole, does different work within Black political life. His formulations open up a space for the critique of racial representation and the class politics of minority group spokespersons in ways that the left has not always been attuned to and is sometimes, frankly, guilty of. Second, I think that the study of Malcolm's Black populism also helps explain, maybe even more than his Black nationalism, the enduring appeal of his rhetoric and thought in Black activist politics, in a way that he feels more contemporary than some of his interlocutors from the same period. As the class politics of Black political life become more clear-cut and more decisive and divisive, it makes sense that his rhetorically resonant constructions of the problem would endure as well. Third, populism also helps us resituate an unprocessed but very intense debate from the 1990s and early 2000s on the question of racial authenticity, and to translate that debate back into the question of politics rather than on the grounds of racial ontology and the metaphysics of race and cultural philosophy where it tended to dwell. Many of us are surprised to see a resurgence in racial authenticity discourse and strong formulations of who is and who is not Black and who can speak on behalf of Black people after living through what we thought was the systematic deconstruction of race and Black identity. People like Skip Gates and Anthony Appiah and Stuart Hall, Hazel Carby. The problem, however, is that that debate focused more on questions of culture, identity, and ontology than politics. And it missed the populist allure and power of racial authenticity talk like the house Negro, field Negro distinction. Finally, and most importantly, Returning to Malcolm's populism forces us to reframe the existing debate on left organizing in Black communities. For incisive critics like Adolph Reed, the class fragmentation of Blacks has reached such significant levels that it no longer makes sense to expect much in the way of a politics of Black solidarity, except manipulation and ideological obfuscation. The abiding hope for someone like Reed is that the clarification of this divergence of Black class interests and the exposing of Black elites' manipulation of identity politics will open up possibilities for Black people to be incorporated into an interracial working class social democratic movement. But what I want to put on the table for consideration is that the unmasking of the class divide also increases the likelihood of more strident forms of Black populism, which mobilize not around social democratic categories, but do draw on class antagonisms, broader ideologies of masculinity, heterosexism, nativism, and religion to explosive effect. This populist turn would necessarily be ideologically promiscuous and could end up allowing for unexpected inroads for right-wing populists to generate reactionary forms of interracial solidarity that contemporary left-wing discourse on race is far too flat-footed to defeat. So those are the things I wanted to put on the table for our discussion, but I just want to end by saying one final word. And it's that whatever the criticisms of Malcolm's thought and rhetoric that I'm testing out here, it's important to note that his life and thinking really did offer a raft of hope, in Ralph Ellison's phrase, amidst the raging waters of American cruelty at the end of the 20th century. Love for Malcolm's memory became a way of expressing love for Black youth, like myself, who were demonized as super predators and failures and dregs on society at the highest levels of government. Malcolm's depiction of the world-expanding, life-enhancing joy of books is still, in my opinion, the greatest depiction of the love of reading in all of Black letters. And he offered an anti-elitist affirmation of intellectual curiosity and education. And at least for Malcolm's greatest devotees, his example taught the profound dignity and courage that can come from being willing to change one's mind and reinvent themselves, even in public. And on our era of social media, I think that's a lesson that's sorely, sorely needed.
Thank you, Brandon. That was brilliant. And I love the way you've moved us from the questions of the international and human rights to these questions of populism. I know I have some thoughts and some reactions, but I want to leave the floor first to Dr. West. Make sure you turn that on.
Just let me say that I hadn't planned to be up here. I'm here to learn and listen from my dear brother. His book on the civil rights movement is the best thing we have for that particular moment in the history of the struggle for Black people, in particular, the struggle for poor and working people in general. And when it appears, it's going to hit. His essay on Stokely Carmichael and African-American political thoughts, a new text that just came out by Melvin Rogers and Jack Turner, is one of the best things on my very dear brother, Kwame Ture, as well. And there's so many things to say, and I appreciate you having me here, though, Brother Bernard. I mean, it's a text on critique of praxis, and I highly recommend that chapter 18 on his life and how it enacts both critique and praxis with Brian Stevenson, but also in conversation with some of the most sophisticated thinkers coming out of the legacy of the Frankfurt School and Foucault and Deleuze and others. But let me just say this. I think we need, after this powerful presentation, just to take a look at our brother. Because anytime you're talking about vicious legacies of white supremacy or any other vicious form of evil that loses sight of people, you want to keep track of his body and his spirit. I'm a son of Malcolm because he loved me and he died for me. That's existential. That's like my uncle, a grandmama. Never be a Muslim. Never be a Black nationalist. I believe nationalism itself is a fetish, and so often the most powerful ideology of the modern world. So we need internationalism, critical of nationalism, but we got to come to terms with forms of nationalism. He's a black nationalist. I'm not a nationalist, but he's closer to me than almost anybody else. And why is that so? It's precisely what our brother was saying in part at the very end of what he was talking about. That Malcolm had what he called a sincerity as my main credential. So already that's a critique of almost any bourgeoisie that poses and postures and will say anything in order to make it rather than live and die because you have a faith in something bigger than you, especially a love of an unloved people. Malcolm begins with the fact that black people have been niggerized, have been taught to hate themselves, been taught to devalue themselves, have been taught they're less beautiful and less moral and less intelligent. And he had to deniggerize black people, to take that fear out of them. Because for 400 years, they've been terrorized. When you terrorized for 400 years, you walk around fearful, scared, intimidated, laughing when it ain't funny and scratching when it don't itch. And what Malcolm did in public, we had black folk do this before, in private. He did it on television. Television had just hit in the 40s and 50s. He the first one on television, Johnny Carson's show. Johnny, what you think? Well, we're going to have a commercial. It's true. Martin never did that. We love Martin. Martin loved us. He never did that. Who is this Malcolm X? Everybody had to find out. That's what Huey Newton said. That's what Bobby Seale said. That's what Erica Huggins said. That's what Nikki Giovanni said. That's what Haki Mahabute said. That's what Maulana Karenga said. That's what the sons and daughters of Malcolm did. So none of us can even begin our starting point of such self-respect and self-confidence without paying our dues to him. And that's a starting point. Why? Because like Malcolm said, 5 days before he shot in Rochester, February 16th, 1965, he said, we are in the midst of a 400-year war. Black people are prisoners of war. And he connected it to the Congo. And he connected it to Vietnam. Isn't that right? It's a powerful speech he gave right before he was shot here on the Audubon Ballroom on 165th Street in Harlem, you see. But Malcolm, what does it mean to be in a war? It means that if you're going to talk about praxis, right, it's a matter of individually being courageous and collectively being willing to create contexts in which people are willing to be counter-terrorists, very much like your text on counter-revolution and counterinsurgency. The black movement has always been a counter-terrorist movement because terrorism's coming at you. And the leaders will be assassinated, incarcerated, misunderstood, misconstrued, marginalized, lied on, rebuked, scorned. That's what it is to be in a war. Don't be surprised. That's why he knew that he could never depend, for the most part, on most of the black bourgeoisie. And it's no accident that Baldwin is coming back so strong. And Baldwin's genius, of course, is beyond description. But there's no sustained critique of the black bourgeoisie in Baldwin. Malcolm begins with that. So in the Obama era, where's the critique that Malcolm would have put forward? They're scared. They're intimidated. How come? They're in professional managerial spaces where their careers are at stake and their identities are at stake and their status is at stake. Malcolm said, I don't give a damn about the white gaze. I don't give a damn about white titles and mainstream establishment approval. I'm connected with these precious brothers and sisters and all of their flaws. That's who I'm going to work with. That's who I'm going to die with. That's how I'm going down. That's Malcolm. He used to say over and over again, if you don't respect them, then you don't respect me. Don't put me on some goddamn isolated pedestal and pantheon and act like you connected with me and you put my brothers and sisters down on the block. That's Malcolm. Now, the critiques that my brother has here, we have more time to get into it, it's very powerful because Malcolm, he dies at 39. He's in prison for 7.5 years. He drops out of school in what, 8th, 9th grade. And he's dialoguing with the Deleuze's and the Leotards and the Foucaults and the Harcourt. They got 2 and 3 PhDs. They've been in libraries for hours. Malcolm made his cell a library. That's autodidactic. Magnificent. Every autodidact got some huge gaps. And every lover of poor people is going to usually spend much more time keeping track of the forms of violence coming at them, the trauma, the tear, and the hatred and the contempt coming at them to generate some kind of armor so that their fortitude is in place even before they get a chance to engage in theoretical reflection on what the alternatives are. And all the theoretical reflections of the alternatives in the world are going to be empty if you don't have yourself and soul and self-confidence and self-respect in place. That's what Malcolm understood. Because in the end, the measure would always be, are you empowering these precious brothers and sisters? And I'm just using these as examples for the wretched of the earth all around the globe. Malcolm is America's Fanon, but he's a Muslim. That's very important. He is America's Fanon, but he's also unschooled, but many colleges went through him. And he is an exemplar of what Socrates says in line 24a of Plato's Apology, the cause of my unpopularity was parrhesia. That's what pushed him into the hemlock. Fearless speech, plain speech, frank speech, unintimidated speech, speaking from your heart. All that was an affirmation of what he got from Africa, what he got from his people in Jim Crow South, what he got from Grenada, his mother, what he got from Reverend Earl Little, his Baptist minister father, who was a Garveyite, which is what? Kenosis, which is at the center of black culture. You love these people, then like James Brown and Aretha Franklin, you're going to empty yourself to empower them. You're going to give everything inside of you to empower them. Brian Stevenson does the same thing. You can put it under liberal legalism if you want, but that brother enacts a kind of legalized kenosis. Isn't that right? You work with him. You do the same thing. For what? For the brothers and sisters on death row and their cousins and their families. Because who else is loving them? Who else cares about them? Who else wants to affirm their humanity and accent their potentiality? That's what Malcolm signifies. But then we come to the issues, crucial issues of what legacies, what spaces are left in a decaying American empire with its corrupt neoliberal elites and its vicious neo-fascists trying to get back in office. What spaces are left in a professional managerial class that is obsessed with its brand and has lost sight of its causes connected to Malcolm? What places are left? In entertainment, in the music. Where's the Donny Hathaways? Where's the Gil Scott-Herons? Where's the Nina Simone? We got some. I'm not saying we don't have any, but these are the questions to raise. Because in a war, when you have been relatively defeated, black folk were defeated in the 60s. Not just pushed against the wall. They killed some of our best leaders. They incarcerated some of our most courageous leaders. The ones who were willing to follow Malcolm, the Mumia Abu-Jamals and the others. That's what they did. That's what gangsters do in ruling class contexts. They do it in Latin America. They do it in the Middle East. They do it in Asia. So what do? Well, you got to be honest the way Brother Brandon has. Let's think critically about some of the constructive moves that Malcolm didn't have time to really think through, even as we keep track of his unbelievable efforts to create some kind of existential armor and psychic armor so that folk can actually wake up and not just wake up, but be fortified. which is to say to think for themselves and organize for themselves, and most importantly, to empty themselves, to be willing to live and to be willing to die. And that is and that's, that's an indictment in some ways of all of us. I mean, Malcolm is like Sarah Vaughan, You're going to pick up your voice and sing and listen to Sarah Vaughan, you probably want to go to the crack house because you ain't going to sound as good as that for the most part. It just ain't going to be a John Coltrane on the saxophone. Just put it down and become a doctor or something because it's just too much. The standard's too high. But at least we know what the standards are. That's part of the legacy of Malcolm X, it seems to me. And then, of course, we got the patriarchy that was unacceptable and inexcusable. You got the homophobia, unacceptable, inexcusable. Probably transphobia if we'd pushed the brother with our non-binary precious folk and so forth. All of those things need to be put on the table in terms of Malcolm's narrowness, but his greatness is still not to be overlooked, it seems to me. But I should stop there.
Thank you, Dr. West. The idea of following up after you is somewhat daunting. And after Brad. Boy, all right. Okay. So that was so powerful and moving for me. First, I'm just deeply grateful for both interventions. I think I'm going to somehow say the same thing, but in a different way, focusing on the term populist and saying the same thing in the sense that the analysis, I agree with the analysis and the dark side of populism that was in part there in some of the words, maybe not in the heart, but in some of the words. But that, in a way, maybe the term populist is only highlighting the negative side of a larger aspect that is so powerful still today, and that is so, and I think that was precisely what you were talking about, Dr. West, which is inclusiveness, okay? So in other words, the inclusiveness of who it is that we're fighting for, and who it is that is by our side, and who it is that we spend our life fighting for. Now, in a way, that can be understood as populism in terms of its anti-elitist valence, right? But that's the negative. The positive of it is inclusion. Now, the reason then that I would hesitate to talk about it through the lens of Black populism, in part, is because that doesn't highlight what is so admirable and loving here, right? Now, and in part, it also has to do with the fact that the term populist has these different valences, right? And so, I mean, you started off talking about the more conventional way of thinking about populism as being anti-elitist. But that's not the only way that people define populism. Another way that people define populism, I mean, if you take Jan Werner Muller's definition from what is populism, right? He defines it as not simply anti-elitism, right? But actually inherently anti-pluralist, representing a form of identity politics that makes kind of exclusive or exclusionary claims to representation, right? So for for someone like Muller, right, it has to have the Schmittian friend-enemy distinction in it. And for a lot of other ways in which we use it today, of course, it's mainly aimed at autocratic forms of political power, closely associated with, in Jason Stanley's sense, ways of thinking fascism, right? So that's almost another problem with using populism, which is that it's not clear exactly whose definition we're using and which one it contains, which is a danger in itself. But I think that the more fundamental point really is that what remains so important and alive, and why I have always, for decades, been inspired by Malcolm X, is his trajectory through the prison and his transformation and his overcoming, and how that transformed him into someone who represented the most marginalized people in the world, right? The most disadvantaged and downtrodden. And so it does allow for that notion of populism, and I think you're right, but it's that they're both there, right? But what we can find, and what it is that can lead us today, is the favorable side of it, and the issues of inclusiveness, which I think are so powerful, and particularly today, particularly as we saw through the movement for Black Lives starting in 2014, 2020. That movement almost reversed the Occupy slogan in my reading of it. The Occupy slogan of we are the 99%, right? It was almost as if we are the 1%, right? It's like we are the most, we're gonna defend the most at the bottom of most harmed, most disadvantaged, and so that leads me to think that I'll take your entire analysis and everything that's been said, but I would give it a different name, and I come up with inclusiveness, but that's not catchy. So names are not my thing. All right. So we need to work on this together, maybe. Go ahead.
Populism, and you tell me what you think about this. That I remember reading Johnny Hickson, Lawrence Goodwin, and others on populism. Populism usually is a group of people who are wounded, experiencing downward mobility and turning toward elites and their greed as a way of empowerment. And therefore, that's why Richard Hofstadter and others said there's always a ressentiment, there's always a resentment there. Whereas Malcolm's base is not really experiencing downward mobility. They about as down as you can get. You know what I mean? There's a sense in which but you got black middle class who are indeed. I mean, a good example would be my dear brother Bernie, who I love and respect. I almost had to take some bullets for. Hopefully in the arm and not the heart, That's the heart is for mom, but Bernie at least take a leg. But I love brother Bernie. But, Bernie was not able to speak to Malcolm's base at all. It was the young people headed toward lower strata of professional managerial class with heavy loans around their backs and being politicized by the 60s. Multiracial solidarity, critiques of Wall Street, and so forth. But it was not from below. If we had been able to get what we wanted, and we tried with every ounce of energy that we had, but we couldn't. So that was in some ways more of a populist, even though Democratic socialism, no, wasn't no Democratic socialism going on. It was New Deal populism going on. That's the most that the decrepit electoral political system can take in America. Because Bernie was called a communist just for pushing that. And he just bringing FDR spirit back to life, right? But that could have been closer to a certain kind of populism. But when we think about black populism, what just tell me what you think about that, brother?
Yeah, no, this is all phenomenal, and thank you both for engaging so richly with the ideas. So, yeah, I wanted to start with one thing, which I think, I sometimes think of Malcolm X as like is the analog to Frederick Douglass. What Frederick Douglass was in the 19th century, Malcolm X in many ways is for the problem of the late 20th century. And it's part of the ideology of race in these periods is to foreclose the horizon of what people can be, right? What you can expect of them. And talk about niggerization. It's like when Frederick Douglass gets up on stage and performs what he performs and says what he says, and you see the quality of his mind, the incisiveness of his arguments, the dignity of his bearing, it's hard to hold the ideology in the same way when you came in. And Malcolm is like that for the ghetto poor. The people we throw away in the prisons, the people we throw away in the ghetto, that's why he meant so much to me, right? You got to understand, that's why it's hard for me to talk about it without starting with myself. Because you got to understand what it's like when it's 5 years old. You're not going to see your brother again until you're 21. And then I go off to Harvard and I see more drugs at Harvard than I see in Baltimore. And it's serious. I mean, it's like if and again, it's like that's when you talk about laughing when it's not funny, scratching when you don't itch. You walk up and down Mount Auburn Street and you just have to swallow it. I couldn't even watch Wolf of Wall Street because the joke is that everybody knows. It's not surprising to anyone that it's a wash in drugs and prostitution and gambling and corruption. It's a joke. The prison is full of people for doing the same thing. Not even a fraction of the same thing. And so that is it for me. And so, part of what I hear in the resistance to the populism concept is partly, I think, a problem of the relationship between the study of Black political thought and the study of critical theories. We're orthogonal, right? So we're coming at a different direction. It's not a neat fit, and so the categories are going to take on a different life and a different tradition. There's a problem independently of critical theory in the study of Malcolm X. It's like, how do you understand his class politics? It's your question, Robin Kelly's question, Adolph Reed's question, Farah Jasmine Griffin's question. How do you understand the fact that this man puts the critique of elites at the front and center of his thought right from the beginning? And it's very unique, but it's not Marxist. It's not a Marxist critique. It's not a liberal critique of inequality. It's something different. And the language of populism draws attention to I think a really important feature of Malcolm's thought, which is that the charge is corruption. Right? Corruption really matters in the analysis. I think there's a slippage, like the Bonikowski stuff, the Jenny Mansbridge stuff is really important for me because they talk about corruption. It's not just the elites versus the people. It's corrupt elites and virtuous people. And so I want to say two things about that. One is that, for me, populism doesn't have the same kind of negative valence that it will have coming out of the European tradition. I'm out of the American tradition. It's coming out of the populist movement, 1890s. The people who tried to stop Jim Crow until they were defeated and corrupted by the ideology. That coming out of speaking on, it's like the old joke about being paranoid. It's like, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. You know, just because people call you a populist doesn't mean the elites ain't corrupt. Right? So there is real corruption. He's not generating it out of nowhere. But here's another reason I like the language. We have to be attentive in this period to how spokespersons construct the group and claim to speak on behalf of the least of these, the truly disadvantaged, the real Black people. We're living through that right now. I mean, it's complicated, but it's what is Black Lives Matter going through? A scandal about $90 million coming in. All of a sudden, there's a $6 million house. People are making influencer videos and sipping champagne. And they're talking about, well, this house is really for the disadvantaged. I'm buying my houses in California for homeless people. I'm speaking on behalf of the least of these. We've got to be able to call into question those constructions and see what's going on at the discursive level. And I think populism foregrounds that, as if we take the concept as one about discourse and construction, subject formation. And it seems to me that we can't be romantic about the trajectory Malcolm's going through. He is coming out of a severely authoritarian movement. His rhetoric is going to be marked by the experience of authoritarianism. He's coming out of a theocratic organization who's invested divinity in the singular personage of Elijah Muhammad. He's murdered in part because he told the truth about Elijah Muhammad's financial and sexual corruption. He was in an organization that beat people for their frailties, killed traitors. You know, we focus on the assassination of Malcolm X. Dozens of people died in the Malcolm X Elijah Muhammad war. He's not the only one that died. It's not like they just killed him. He's not the only one that got beat up. He's not the only one that got jumped. They firebombed his house. They could have killed his whole family. So there is a worry in inheriting Malcolm X, because you got to be careful when he says that the people who disagree with me are sick. They're psychologically sick. They love white people so much that they make these kinds of arguments. Well, that means we can't have a reasonable debate about the role of Christian love ethics in Black political culture. I'm ambivalent. I have lots of critiques. I have lots of things I defend. But we can't even have that debate because you're a sick person. You're a crazy person. You're in love with the white man. That's not pluralist. When he says you can't, when you define the group such that we're the authentic representatives, right? We are the masses, and these other people, the house Negroes, they are the traitors. They work for the enemy. I mean, you go back to the war metaphor. Let's take it all away. You're a house Negro, you work for the enemy. Why would I listen to you? Why would I let you in the meeting? That's why every time you hear Malcolm X give a speech about the Black United Front and how we need to put our differences aside and work together and have a unified face, another anti-pluralist demand, he can't even keep it together for the next 5 minutes before he's back attacking the leaders for being Uncle Tom's handkerchief heads, sellouts, corrupt. That's a real thing. And I worry that that's coming down the pike. We're not in a moment any longer of where we can pretend the class divisions don't exist in Black America. Even white people are figuring that out now. Okay?
The problem, though, is that Malcolm was not himself invited in the dialogue with the Black leaders of his day. See, one of the things that Martin should have done was gone over and talked to the brother. Martin wouldn't come within 50 feet of him. He was scared. Martin, how come you scared? Because white folk may think that, lo and behold, I think they white devils. Well, you're dealing with white folk who think black people are less than human every day of your life. Where's the double standards are operating? Come on, Martin. I thought you was a free black man. How come you can't sit down with Malcolm? How come they need to bring him in? And Malcolm didn't discover, lo and behold, Martin, I know he willing to die too. I call him Uncle Tom and so and so and so and so. But when Malcolm went down to Selma and met with Coretta, what was the dialogue? I'm here to do everything I can, but Martin's in jail. Martin's in jail at the time. You see, all of a sudden you got a connection. June 27th, 1964, the FBI sees what? They in communication. They both want to go to the UN to put the United States on trial for the violation of human rights. They're trying to get together. The week before Malcolm was shot, they're trying to get together. So that there's got to be some mutuality to bring Malcolm in, because Malcolm got something to say. And that's how you grow. That's what dialogue's about. I disagree with Bernard on Deleuze and Nietzsche. You got too much Nietzsche, brother. Let's sit down and have a drink. Let's sit down and have a drink. I mean, we get to, you wrestle, and so it is with Ella Baker, and so it is with Fannie Lou Hamer. Now, Malcolm loved Fannie. Gloria Richardson. Fannie, with her Bible, singing This Little Light of Mine, loving the same people Martin was. They spoke together right here in New York, didn't they? So that's part of the engagement. That's what praxis is. We all fallible and finite and fallen, and therefore we need each other in terms of learning and listening. That's what the jazz musicians teach us. That's what they teach us. Clifford Brown, how you hitting that note, man? Well, Louis hit it, I can hit it, but I can't hit it. I've been working on it for 2 weeks. Come to my house, we work it out.
But this is another piece of like why Malcolm's so important. So like one reason for Black solidarity to be so fragile is that you've got Black middle class folks, Black elite folks who don't understand the decisions and judgments that people make when they're under the severe deprivation of the ghetto. You know, people like my mama saying, why, yeah, God bless my mother. Like, why would you sell dope? You know what it's going to end in. Why would you do that? Why would you have a kid in this circumstance? And this is Tommy Shelby's great book, Dark Ghettos. And it's coming out of the Malcolm X tradition insofar as Malcolm tries to reconstruct the moral agency and political judgment of people under pressure. He lets you understand why people make the decisions that they make, the kind of genius it takes to do some of these practices, and the self-respect and dignity people are trying to preserve. And so it makes, one of the big problems with Black solidarity, and you can track this all the way down from Du Bois, is that it's one-sided. It's the elite haranguing the poor. Get it together, pull your pants up, straighten up, get respectable. You're embarrassing us. You're holding us back. The Bill Cosby speech. We didn't, Martin Luther King didn't die for you to sell dope, right? Well, Malcolm raises that conversation to more of a dialogue. And that is a really important contribution, that it pierces that. And he does it in a way, I think this is really important too, he does it in a way that that never loses track of the complexity of moral agency. So one of the things he wants to say is he doesn't just rest on the kind of familiar, kind of facile left response, which is that, everything is resistance, right? He says, well, this legal order is not legitimate. You're right to disobey it. You're right to resist illegitimate authority. And he's willing to go with you all the way up to military conscription, right? But then he wants to raise another question about ethics, about the good, and about the kind of political project you need to defeat your real problem, your real obstacle, the structural injustice of this society, of this global order. And he wants to raise a question that it's not about breaking the law. It's about certain practices of crime, of addiction. He sees them as self-undermining. that they block you from developing the kinds of capacities and achieving the kinds of goods that he thinks are commensurate with a life of real flourishing. And they make it really difficult to organize the kind of solidarity and discipline you need to resist domination. Now, those are complicated questions. There are things you could disagree. He's maybe the most ascetic figure in the Black tradition, but he at least elevates the level of conversation beyond the kind of facile oppositions of, resistance and acquiescence. He says, no, what's good? What do we need to win? And that utterly transforms the questions that animate the ethics of the oppressed. Not a lot of people doing that work. Tommy Shelby is probably the leading person. There's not a lot of people putting that front and center at critical theory and praxis. So when you ask the question, how do you organize the least of these? How do you organize the truly disadvantaged? Those are questions you have to ask, right? Because you're exhorting people to do things that seem really difficult, and that many on the left, many liberals will say, you don't have any right to ask them to do that. Malcolm disagrees.
All right, I'm not going to give up though. You're right, and I'm taken by many pieces of this. Okay, particularly the fact of a different tradition on the notion of populism. I think that's really important. I think that's right. Coming from a critical European tradition to populism versus an American, African American, a notion of populism from the soil up. So I think that's important, and maybe that alone might weigh in its favor. And I also appreciate the idea of using the term Black populism in part to also reject certain aspects. We were talking about the patriarchy, we were talking about the homophobia, and certain aspects possibly, and of course, so we're navigating different speeches at different times, right? And so you took us back to some of the Nation of Islam, right? And that changes very much, but maybe in part some of the notion of Black populism could help us make some distinctions there. But it's got to be at the very least, twined. Even if we retain it, even if you're going to retain it, but even if I retain it, it's got to be twined with that positive aspect that is admirable, that we do want to turn back to Malcolm X. We want that to inspire, to continue to inspire us. And it's something about humility, brotherhood and sisterhood, love, mercy, just mercy, something about the wretched of the earth, right? It's that I don't think comes out sufficiently with just Black populism, okay? And go ahead.
Black is still important. They got a capital B on it, not a small b now. It's not a small b we talking about it. It's a huge B. And the reason why it's a huge B is because white supremacy is so huge. If it's coming down on your babies, it's coming down on your working class, it's coming down on poor people, it's coming down on Black folk across the board, and you can get lynched, devalued, lied on, and so forth. You need something big to deal with something big. It's Black revolutionary. Ain't got nothing to do with mainstream deodorized discourses about populism. No. But then all three together create something very distinctive among these distinct people in the midst of an American empire as it's connected predatory capitalist processes all around the world connected with a white supremacist system that's all around the world. Is that fair?
I think that's right. I mean, so that's partly what I'm trying to end on, right? So, but this is very helpful because, so like when I raise a question at the end, right? Here's the class fragmentation. Here's the divisiveness. Here's the resentments, many of which are legitimate. Here's the corruption, many of which is real. What's the response? So there's a socialist response that says, well, this is our opening to organize the multiracial working class. Because now they're going to be disabused of identitarian logic, identity politics, neoliberal identity politics, Adolph's formulation. Well, and I'm not saying he would disagree with this. I don't know what he would think about this, but what I'm trying to say is that there's another way to fill that void, which is ideologically promiscuous. It's to raise the question of, well, it's not just that we have a class division. The black people, the real black people, have been betrayed by our corrupt elites. Now that could take a revolutionary turn, and as it did for Malcolm, but it could also take a reactionary turn, which is the thing I'm worried about. So, okay, we're gearing up. As you said, neo-fascists trying to take back the White House. We're gearing up for this. There's a concerted effort to recruit people of color to that coalition. Not everybody, of course, but some.
More black brothers and black sisters.
And this is the question. How? Well, your black elites, which are your protest elites, Black Lives Matter, academics, the Obama contingent, well, they're betraying the real folk, the real working class folk. And they're leading us into things that the real folk know are pathological in the realm of gender identity, in the realm of apostasy and irreligion, in the realm of socialism. That rhetoric has an explosive power because it does tap into a real charge of corruption and betrayal and a real commitment to the identity and the sense of peoplehood, but it drags it in a really reactionary dimension. That's the fear that I'm working with. I wrote a piece a couple years ago. I've been working through these issues for a while. Wrote a piece a couple years ago reviewing Corey Robbins' book on Clarence Thomas, The Enigma of Clarence Thomas. And in the piece, I had a line that said, Black nationalism's at its lowest ebb at any time in memory, that Black nationalism is basically dead. And I really regret writing that line. I don't think that's correct anymore. In part because I didn't know where to look. Started go online. I've started to do some like digital public sphere research, and it's thriving online. You know, the most watched video I've ever done is with this man. It's me, Cornel West, Elizabeth Hinton, Kienga Yamada Taylor, Robin Kelly. You know, it's like the leading lights to the left and me. And I think the thing's got like 7,000 views. Some of these Black nationalist folks that running lectures, running discussion groups, talking about relationships, every video they drop, 50,000, 40,000, 60,000. They have a huge audience. And what is the message that people are trying out? Not everybody, but some of them are trying out what I think of are these kind of populist Black nationalist arguments. Nativism, right? The real Black masses are being betrayed by the recruitment of African elites to U.S. soil, Afro-Caribbean elites, and the immigration policies. They're being, with the subway shooter, just here the other week, what were his videos? We are being betrayed by Black women who are marrying out of the group. Elite Black women are betraying us. They're all marrying white women. They turn their back on the Black masses. Right? This is out there. And the reason I'm interested in the populist language, because it's about discourse, it's about argument construction. It's about formulating these kinds of claims of grievances into a chain and to an identity that I think has valence. And if you can't even see that challenge until it's too late, if our flat-footed discourse of race, where we're on the left are like super susceptible to formulations of like, I speak for the most downtrodden Black people. We're very susceptible to that. We're very susceptible to people who claim to speak on behalf of the group from some uninterrogated position. That's going to get exploited in this new terrain. And we don't have a language to analyze that or assess it. So that's partly what's motivating my experimentation with the populist concept.
Archival evidence you're talking about, though, has to do with just chronic trauma that really doesn't have a politics. It's just people trying to not kill themselves, just get up in the morning and sustain some capacity for intimacy and vulnerability so they don't suffer from the incapacity to love, which is the ultimate logic of predatory capitalist culture. Commodification of a culture is to teach people that all you have is lust and no love. All you have is manipulation and no nurturing and caring. It's like Hamlet writ large. Hamlet suffers from the incapacity to love. We know that. Shakespeare ain't no joke. That was already a critique of the culture. All the sophisticated reflections. Well, you maybe had love of Horatio, but ask Ophelia, ask Gertrude. You see, what happens when your soul is evacuated, when it's all about capital and money and status and spectacle and image and manipulation and domination? What happens? Well, American culture writ large. So that then you got the Black folk wrestling with the white supremacy inside of it. And Black nationalism was simply a way of saying, you know, hold on to your Blackness. Be Black joy. I mean, the discourse on Black joy now is, it's a nationalist discourse. It's probably as much peoplehood as it is nationhood, though. So the nationalism was really about land, territories, institutions of monopoly on violence, institutions of public administration. That's full-fledged nationalism. Proto-nationalism is just a people trying to somehow create some ways of dealing with not being crushed by the hatred and trauma coming at them. So a lot of it's self-help and is psychic, and it's understandable because that's always been the case, really. But take the case of Thurgood Marshall. It's very interesting. Malcolm probably had a hatred of Thurgood Marshall more than anybody of the elite. Because Thurgood came out way back in 1950. The Muslims ain't nothing but a group of thugs who are thriving on Arab money. Now, keep in mind, Malcolm, for the first 7.5 years of his life, he has no visibility whatsoever in mainstream white America. It's only when Mike Wallace makes the peace in 1959, white folk even hear about him. He's already been out there. And Thurgood comes quickly. Now, Thurgood is doing what? Thurgood's a great man in many ways, but he hated King. How come? King got mass movement. He said, no, we take care of it in the courtroom. No, Thurgood. Yeah, I think we can. No, Thurgood, he can't. Then what does he do? Connects with the FBI. Keeps track on Malcolm and Martin. Constant communication with J. Edgar Hoover. Now, see, that's what Malcolm's talking about. That's what he's talking about. That somebody who is going on his way to the Supreme Court is one of the exemplars of liberal legalism, and he is a great man in a certain sense. But anybody wearing a wire, working with the FBI, calling J. Edgar Hoover on Martin and Malcolm, for me, is also a gangster. Now, I say that, in different contexts. It's, West don't crack, West lost his mind. No, I'm just trying to tell the truth. Somebody come in. Du Bois did the same thing with Garvey. He worked with the then FBI to get him deported. That's gangster activity on behalf of Du Bois. He's wrong. And they're going to do the same thing to him in 1951 when he's in court, in handcuffs, calling him a communist. So that it's just truth-telling. It has to be across the board. It will be one of the black lumpen proletariat who will kill Malcolm. It's not going to be Thurgood Marshall's circle that kills Malcolm. It's going to come from below. Betrayal is promiscuous. Anybody can betray somebody. It's a human thing. And that's part of the openness of, I mean, one of the consequences of your dialogue in terms of keeping track of these kinds of betrayals.
Yeah. Now, first of all, we should open it up to questions
Yes, of
and other
course.
people
Sorry.
as well. We're going to do that in a minute. No, I know we could. I know, but before I do that, I just want just one more take. So you're putting your finger on the potential ideological and political drift, the way in which it can spin in a bad direction, particularly today, right? Using when you use black populism, you're emphasizing particularly the way in which that ideological and political drift could kind of harm, right? I don't know if that term, though, allows for the positive ideological and political drift in the other direction. You know what I mean? And so that's my only concern. In other words, we've got to be finding here what it is that we could draw on usefully, positively for praxis, right? And I'm not sure that there's an equal, it's not like, I don't think it's 50-50 as to which way ideological drift is going to go with black populism. And so maybe it needs to be twined with another thing. But you go ahead, and then I'm gonna.
No, this is
questions coming in.
Yeah, this is really good. So I'm gonna take yours first, and then Brother West. So, I mean, I think one worry that you may have that I should clarify is that I don't take the populist description to be exhaustive of Malcolm's thought. So I get your point, but I'm here. I came down on the train because I love Malcolm X. I think he's a profoundly important person. I'm teaching an entire class with Malcolm X right now, 13 weeks of Malcolm X. Writing a book on Malcolm X. So I hear you. It's just that when I say I'm taking this kind of analysis of populism that really focuses on discursive construction, the way people make claims in politics and public, this is a way he speaks sometimes. It's not the only way he speaks. He also speaks as a Muslim, right? As a person of faith. He speaks as a revolutionary. Sometimes he may speak as a revolutionary populist. I'm most moved when he speaks as a person who is a minister, right? My piece is called Malcolm's Ministry for a reason. My favorite story about Malcolm X is from Les Payne and Tamara Payne's biography. And he talks about, because it's really great in getting into the granular detail of how he organizes. So he talks about how they set up a mosque in Hartford. They live in communal style, military training, karate trainings, book club, prayer. It's just, again, it's like, how do you know I love you? Well, I'm here. I live here. How do we know Martin Luther King loves you? I moved my family to the ghetto in Chicago, the slums of Chicago. The landlord's so scared they fixed the whole building up before Martin Luther King can get there. Because they didn't want it to look like it does when the real downtrodden and disadvantaged are living there. Malcolm, the story I love is like, he has a tactic that he uses when he's organizing young men in particular. And he says, when you go to work, and everybody's got a white boss at this point, when you go to work, look your white boss in the eye when you speak to him. Tomorrow, just go look your white boss in the eye. The men come back, nobody can do it. Now that's deep. People forget the terror that people died for looking white men in the eye, looking at white women in the eye. And to try to work somebody out of that kind of fear is a ministry. Spiritual armor, cultivation of intelligence and judgment, self-confidence, self-esteem. So none of that, I think, turns on the populist charge, which I think is just a different question. All of that is there, and it's rooted in a deeper spiritual love for people. We have to talk about religion and Islam. We have to talk about his own transformation. So there's that. And then the last thing, and I'll be super, super brief here. You know, I love what you're doing with the turn to praxis. And the subtitle of my course on Malcolm X is Critique, Praxis, and Judgment. Because I'm concerned about how he makes judgments. I'm concerned about how he pursues his critique, but I'm also concerned about praxis. And one of the things that I think is really evaded in almost all academic left theory is the question you're talking about, is how do you deal with state repression and subversion? You know, they've got 3 top-level, highest classification informants from the FBI at the highest levels of the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad is the single most surveilled person in the history of the United States up to that point. Malcolm, organization infiltrated before it could get started. You've got people like Thurgood Marshall, Du Bois, using that power that they know is out there against their enemies, or people who think are their enemies, and then getting destroyed by the same power. We have not really confronted that as a field that's ostensibly concerned about politics and praxis. We don't have good principles of judgment about what you're supposed to do. We don't have ways of talking about it, but it's real. And it's happening, as you've written a lot about, counter-revolution, right? There's just not enough of that kind of work being done right now. And I just want to affirm your interventions and say that Malcolm X is another lens through which to discuss these kind of questions. Like, how do you do the work of ministry, the work of revolution, while knowing that is going on in the background? That's really difficult.
All right, so I want to bring folks in. We've got Daryl Robertson on Zoom, and if we can do that, we got a huge Zoom audience as well, and yeah, we got Zoom going on. We got and live stream, so it's all over. You're gonna see in a minute. Okay, hold on. It's gonna be coming in, I think. But in the meantime, we got some questions right here. So why don't I pass you my mic, and then when you start.
Thank you both so much. Beautiful conversation. The word that kept popping up often was identity. And one of the first mind-blowing existential paradigm shifts that I heard from Malcolm was the report, and I've heard it 3 different versions, where in one case, the reporter asked him how come he didn't agree with Martin Luther King's goal of equality. And he laughed and answered that equality has nothing to do with white people, and that he had no goal, didn't want to be equal to white people, and that white people were not the yardstick or the criteria to measure equality, especially from him. As you said, on television, nobody talked like that before.
No, it's a critical point. It's actually why I don't use achievement gap discourse. So I don't use the language of achievement gap ever, because I think it inferiorizes Black people, number one, and it tricks both Black people and white people and white people in the United States as to construing the level of average achievement of white people in the United States as being sufficient, when it is in fact far, far behind what a reasonable and thoughtful and successful education would look like. So it's a great example of the ways in which white supremacist ideology can seep into what seem like neutral categories and reinforce a sense of inferiority and superiority that's unmoored from any perceptive account of reality and what human flourishing would actually demand. So I think it's a perfect example.
Great, thanks. Now let me just see if the technology is going to work for a second. Daryl, are you there? Can we hear you or not? Okay, we're going to work on this a little more.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, Daryl, you there?
Oh,
Okay,
yes,
great.
I'm here. I'm
All
here.
right, so this is Daryl Robertson. He was on our panel when we did George Jackson. Albert Woodfox was with us. Albert Woodfox and great panel. Joy James with us and Daryl Robertson, who actually Daryl's going to start as a senior editor for culture at Esquire on Monday, right, Daryl?
Yes, sir. Monday,
All
April
right.
25th. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, go ahead, Daryl. Go ahead.
All right. Well, first of all, this is a great discussion. But I want to ask everyone on the panel, could you talk about how Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam use culture to combat drug addiction? Can you speak on that?
This is the last part. To combat what?
Sorry, say that again. Say that again. What to combat drug addiction? What was it?
Use culture. How they use culture to combat drug addiction.
How do you use culture to combat drug addiction? Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Yeah, I can see that your wheels are spinning, Daryl, on the culture editor. All right, go ahead.
Well, so Malcolm has a great section of the Autobiography where he explains, for those of you who don't know, one of the nation's early claims to fame was to be able to provide effective drug rehabilitation, like rehabilitation from addiction. And one of the things that they did that was so effective, at least in Malcolm's narration of it, is that they would recruit people who had been addicts themselves to do the work of counseling. So again, the reason why that's important in a broader political story is that, at least in Malcolm's organizing of the nation and reflects some degree of Elijah Muhammad's commitments, there's never a diminishment of your agency as a political being, as a contributor to organizational viability and vitality. Even the thing that you might look back on as the worst part of your life, the worst thing that ever happened to you, can become part of the tool for you to do good in the world. That's a ministry point, right? It's a deeply religious ethos that's easy to lose track of in a kind of secular world, but that's the model that they're drawing on to do that work. So, it's a culture of, not so much expressive culture, but a culture of intensive showing up day after day, a first-person testimony of surrounding and wrapping people in a new context that helps them break their old habits. It's a lot of habit formation and disciplinary formation. Now that can go awry pretty badly. I mean, the nation could also be really punitive and violent. It relied a lot on ostracism to punish people when they slipped up. And that's very difficult with an addiction question. But at its best, that's the effective move that the nation would draw on.
We've got another question in back here. And please feel free to introduce yourself at the beginning if you'd like. We got a question over there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Bikram Gill. I teach at Virginia Tech in political science department. Real quick, I was walking down the street, down the block, and I saw somebody who looked really familiar, and I was like, that looks like Cornel West. And then I pulled up close, and I've never met him, and I was really just taken, really surprised. And I was going to be here anyway. I'm teaching a class at People's Forum on political economy, and I was giving a talk tomorrow on decolonization, and I was really just taken by the whole conversation. And Dr. Terry, to borrow one of Dr. West's words, that was a revelation. So I'm really thankful for that. I have a question and a kind of a concern where there's a really powerful. I was really taken by the opening of your talk, the paper, sovereignty, independence, land, right? And then you end on populism and the limits of where we are today, but you don't come back to land. And I want to pose this question in a particular way because And I don't think inclusiveness is sufficient to get us to where we want to get to. I think that's maybe a turn towards a liberal politic, and I think the land question is a key question. And this is a question that then draws the Black struggle today into conversation with third world struggles, which is where they always were in conversation from Du Bois and Black Reconstruction. You know, the question in the South around land reclamation, right? Around before the landlords and plantation owners are restored land, that dynamic plays out across the third world. US imperialism is everywhere, denying land to the peasant and restoring landlord power, right? So this connection today remains prominent, right? And I think the question I want to pose is, in the class I'm teaching here, the thinker we're thinking about most is Samir Amin, who's a third world Marxist thinker. And so you had mentioned that this is not a socialist or Marxist question that Malcolm is posing, right? But the question of ownership over land, the question of the ownership of the means of production, of the relations of production, is an irreducibly Marxist socialist question, right? And so, and the deferral of that question in America is what opens the path for reaction, right? How Dr. West phrased it, the decrepit political system. Well, what can't you ask in America ever is who owns what, right? Underneath the sign of bourgeois property, underneath the sign of whatever, anything is possible. You can seek recognition, but you don't have the power, right, to enforce an equal relationship, right? That material power question. And that's where Dr. West, I would respectfully disagree on the nationalist, internationalist equation, because Frantz Fanon, one of Malcolm's teachers, or somebody who Malcolm read, what does Fanon say? He says, I want a world of love. I was willing to forget everything, but you weren't. So then Fanon understands he has to encounter the white world with a power. Because when one can violate you with impunity, there's no grounds for love. Right now, and how do you construct a power that can match, right? So that you can't sidestep the national question, right? You have to establish sovereignty, sovereign power that forces the other to respect you on the basis of power, right? And that sovereignty must be based upon land. And now a land that is populist, a landed regime that is not held by a bourgeoisie or a landlord class, but that is distributed broadly, right? A broad land distribution. Now this is what Samir Amin refers to as a sovereign popular project today in the third world, right? He is saying the question that looms in the face of US imperialism globally is the establishment of a sovereignty that can confront US power, but this can't be based on a sovereignty that is grounded in the comprador class, or what Reed might call the Black elite, right? The comprador class versus the popular class is the dispossessed, the racialized that are dispossessed. In between, there's this layer of the comprador who are invested in the system. So I guess I'll end with that question. When you said you'll peel back now through the class question today, right? The question that Fannie Lou Hamer puts on the table, that Du Bois puts on the table, that Malcolm puts on the table of land, that Harry Haywood puts on the table in a different way in the Black communist tradition around the national question, right? Around the reclamation of land, around building out a sovereign basis, right? Through which you don't beg the US white supremacist state for recognition,
Right.
but enforce it. Sorry. So I'll just
Thank you so much. Terrific. Dr. West, do you want to say a few words on that?
Wish we all were going to your lecture tomorrow, because you got some very powerful things to say. It's just 50 years ago that Black people had about 38 acres in the South. Now we got 44 acres, 38 million versus 4 million. See, so that the great migration that people talk about, people also talk about it as land dispossession. That was one reason why they had the Black relocation committees under the white elites in the South, to get these Black folk out, not just to diminish their political power, but to gain access to their land. But under contemporary capitalist conditions, even land might not be enough. Circulation of capital, the asymmetric relations of power in workplaces, the ways in which people are pacified, the ways in which people are getting access to profits without any talk seriously about land. It's a very different economic configuration, still under profit maximization. So I'm not sure that the kind of discourse that Harry Haywood, I was blessed to know Harry Haywood, I sat at his feet. He's Black Nation thesis way back in the 30s, coming out of Omaha, same city that produced Malcolm. That he was then talking when I talked to him in the 70s and 80s. He was saying, well, you know, Brother West, this land thing that we were into in the 20s and 30s doesn't have the same impact that it does under highly proletarianized, industrialized, urbanized context. And now that was 50 years ago. So I hear what you're saying. Samir Amin is a very important voice. There's no doubt. There's no doubt about that. And there's no doubt that there's more black folk going to the South than black folk from the South coming to the North. That's what Charles Blow's book's about. Trying to get black folk to go back to the South, gain access to land, be a political base, because the neo-fascists are on the way.
Thank you. We have one more question. I think we have time for one more question. Then maybe we'll use this question as a way to kind of wrap up. And yeah, we got it back. All right. And please introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Abby. I'm a graduate student at Columbia. Thank you guys for your talk. I just want to pull together a few threads. Excuse my notes. That's kind of a. So I'm interested that you started your talk in the 90s and you referred to Malcolm X as sort of an intoxicant, and then we get to his pathologizing of the black elites and sort of his dip into that sort of psychology and the use of Fanon just in general, right? He's trained as a psychoanalyst, and some of his most urgent work is using the psyche rather than necessarily strict political theory. And then Dr. West, your points about obviously trauma, but then comparing that to perhaps Bernie's failure to create, and just the movement's failure to create a coalition. You can't help but think that he doesn't have a way into the psyche of a different group. He doesn't have the same psychoanalytical charge there. Perhaps he doesn't have the same. It's such an economic message. And then just more generally thinking about David Scott's critique or intervention on C.L.R. James and his idea that it just seems to me that most of his regarding Black Jacobins as a romance or a tragedy, right? It seems to me that some of the most important interventions, particularly in Black thought and decolonial thought, has never been in strictly political terms. And I'm wondering why, or I'm wondering if you guys could speak a little bit about how maybe literature, psychoanalysis, all of those sort of not strictly political things seem to be better mediums for these struggles, and then how maybe that might be helpful or limiting. It seems really exciting, but also extremely limiting in the sense that it can be total affect rather than material. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that great question. I think that's a good way to kind of give some closing thoughts here. Who wants to start?
I don't want to go after him.
Okay, all right. I know that feeling.
Look, you're not gonna dunk on me all night. I don't know when to get out of the way. So, no, these are great questions. I'll take what I think is the easiest one first, and then I'll say the hard one. So, it's very important that Malcolm's greatest testament is an autobiography. And that the most enduring works about him are biographies, not political theory texts. So I'm venturing into a very dangerous terrain and trying to do otherwise, because his life is the testament, right? It's one of the great things about the Marable book is that you can see Alex Haley. He knows it's a great story, but then as he's doing the process of interviewing Malcolm, he gets carried away. He's like, this is crazier than I could have ever imagined. This story is one of the most important stories of the 20th century, and it is. The sheer improbability of it. The only analogy is Frederick Douglass, right? That a person who, the Ku Klux Klan is attacking his family while he's in the womb, chasing his family across the Midwest. He's seen the jail cells. He's seen the brothels, the drug dens. He's debated at Harvard. He's in the nation. He's in a totally isolated Black world, where the white world doesn't even know who he is. What is that? That's a rare experience for Black people. So he's just had these tremendous experiences that could only be conveyed in a literary text, an autobiographical text, and that they can only speak to you the way they do because he speaks in the first person, right? It allows you to enter into the subjectivity and recognize your own fear, your own humiliation, your own trepidation, and imagine yourself as something else, and imagine yourself as something else again. Like that spirit of self-transformation there's nothing like that. And it's hard to convey that in a speech or a political theory text or something like that. So you need those, especially because so much of what the Black condition is a psychological assault, right? That's why autobiography is so important in the tradition. How else can you convey what it's like to be a problem? That's the easy question. The hard question is the psychological one. I don't quite know how to think about it. I'm still trying to figure that out because I think you've noticed I have a lot of hesitation with the strong psychoanalytic readings that Malcolm produces because I think they foreclose a kind of dialogue. I think they foreclose a sense of plurality. And I think they pathologize people. And we didn't get into this, but sometimes he pathologizes the very people he tries to represent. You know, he could talk really bad about the Black poor too. But you can see some of it's not wrong. And what I would like to see more of in Malcolm, and he sometimes has this, but I think it sometimes comes unmoored, is a serious account, kind of like Professor West's account in Black nihilism and race matters. It's like where you try to really link the psychoanalytic thing to the materialist analysis. So like, here's an example that'll be relevant to anybody on the left from your essay on Black intellectuals. So one of the things Professor West argues, which is a deep thing, and I've experienced this, is that when you're Black intellectual and you're marginalized in most spaces, but you're celebrated on the left, the desire to be affirmed, the desire to be told you really are smart, you really have something to contribute, can lead you to say the things people want to hear. And you can lose track of your own distinctive voice and to the point where you become something like Malcolm's describing. Somebody who's just trying to fit in, who parrots the line, who says what people want to hear. But that's a materialist analysis that explains the psychological reaction. It's a normal psychological trait, not a pathology, exacerbated by an unjust situation. That to me is a powerful rendering of what starts to look free-floating when you're just lobbing Uncle Tom, handkerchief head, those kind of diatribes. So that's the hardest part of this book, I think, for me to work through. But I appreciate the opportunity to think about it with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all. And I will alley-oop.
Absolutely. Now, I think the one thing we got to recognize that our dear brother, he was an artist. He was an artist of spoken word. And you can't talk about critical praxis among oppressed people unless you talk about art. You have to. I gave you an example. First time Black people ever came together in public spaces and part of the National Public Civic Convention movement. Henry Highland Garnett got one leg, leaning on a crutch. Artist, minister, musicality in the way he speaks. And he says, one thing we're going to get clear, first time we come together for Black people, we are in no way similar to that of the Israelites in the Christian Old Testament or in Hebrew scripture. For Black people, Pharaoh is on both sides of the bloody Red Seas. Now that that's not proto-Afro-pessimism. The brother Negro just telling the truth. And somebody say, can somebody sing a song, please? Because performance authorizes alternative visions and ways of being in the world, which is a foretaste of your joy and your freedom and your dignity and your sanity, as you then are refortified to engage in struggle. Another example, Martin Luther King Jr. goes to Elijah Muhammad 2 weeks before he dies. He sees two people, right? Elijah Muhammad and Mira Baraka. What's Martin dealing with? And this is Baraka in his black arts, black nationalist. He's not a Marxist-Leninist yet, you see. Exactly. Well, we're told we don't know what really happened. But Elijah Muhammad, remember what Baldwin says about Elijah Muhammad? I wonder what kind of blues he would sound like if he could sing when he looked at his face. Because he's coming out of Sandersville, Georgia, where he's seen his loved ones get lynched over and over and over again, right? And he turns to Martin. He speaks real soft. He said, "See, Martin, now, you know that you're integrating into a burning house, and you know the white folk not going to accept you. And when the black kids go to school in the neighborhoods or fall in love with the white little girls, that they're going to turn away. There's always a small slice that won't, but generally speaking, they will. You know that, Martin. There's no chance whatsoever of integration in a white supremacist world." Martin put his head down. But Elijah, your project is to create a black nation in Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida. That's got the chance of a snowball in hell, too. And they both put their head down. And you could hear the sister from 1837 saying, "Could somebody please sing a song?" And we laugh, but we know that's real. Because anybody who's in the struggle knows that the moments of despair, the moments of despair, the despondency, the disillusionment, the arts is not an ornamental thing. It's constitutive of who we are in terms of not just singing and painting, but connecting in communities with senses of humor and irony and laughter, and then with our subtle analysis of power and domination and oppression. And so art becomes, if not a starting point, certainly a brook of fire for any connection of critical theory and praxis in the history of any oppressed people, but especially black folk. Especially black folk. Because when it comes to the highest levels of confidence, sonic confidence, that's exactly the language that our dear brother, the greatest of all hip-hop artists, John Coltrane of hip-hop, our dear brother from Long Island, Rakim. Yes. You read his book, he got a whole chapter on sonic confidence. And that sonic confidence is a form of what the academicians would call agency. Okay, whatever you want to call it. All right. Deodorize it, whatever you want to call it. It's people believing in themselves against the wall and willing to fight and willing to sacrifice and willing to live and die. That's what we're talking about. That's what the arts do at their best. And that's why this question about how do you wrestle with the kind of thing that Malcolm was talking about. There's another moment, and you remember in his autobiography, when he finally dances at the Duke Ellington band, and he's dancing with Laura. You remember his girlfriend. And what does Duke do? He sees that brother, he takes his hat, he said, that's one of the great moments in the history of modern culture. Duke Ellington taking his hat and bowing to Malcolm X. But he's Malcolm Little. He's still a gangster. It's Malcolm Little. But he bows. Why? Because at that moment, all of the sense of being at home, all of the sense of being outside the white supremacist gaze, all of the sense of not having to adapt to the powers that be, just being one's own funky black human self. That is a precondition for any kind of participation in the black freedom movement. That's what he's getting at. And without that, we're even in worse trouble than we thought. But thank God we've got a rich tradition of the artistry, various forms of artistry coming from below. Coming from below. We're not talking about another essay on Glenn Gould, you know what I mean? We're talking about what's happening with these precious creative folk who are making sense of the world musically, artistically, in painting and sculpture and all the other forms of art that we know. Sorry to go on so long. But we want to thank Brother Bernard and our dear brother Brandon. Magnificent conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. West, Brandon, Terry. It's been an amazing conversation. So powerful, so moving, and so inspiring. So we've got a lot to do, but I think that this helped us move forward. I want to thank you all for coming out. Thanks, Fonda Shen and David and everyone for making this possible, and everyone at the People's Forum. You guys are great. We love you. Thank you. We're working on a few things. I got something going on with Tony Negri, so we're gonna have a piece with Tony Negri, who's got a lot to say on these topics. And we've also got Sarah Haley on June 1st, right here, June 1st, People's Forum. We're studying abolition, feminism now. So please keep on joining us, and we'll see you soon. But a big thank you and a big hand of applause again for Brandon Terry, Cornel West. Thanks.